Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Hollywood. I'm the Associate Director here at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Today's event is very special as we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransports, the first of which took place December 2nd, 1938, just 3 weeks after the violent anti-Jewish pogrom known as Kristallnacht. In today's world, where we still see instances of intense anti-Semitism around the world, where can we look for hope, for compassion, for lessons on how to be upstanders instead of bystanders during times of conflict? Luckily, we can look back in history to 1938, to the thousands of people in the United Kingdom who opened their doors to 10,000 Jewish children, refugees who were sent alone far from their homes by their parents so that they might live. As an educator, I see it as a happy story, where due to the kindness of British people, thousands of children got a second chance at life. But as a mother, I cannot begin to fathom the difficult choice that thousands of parents had to make. Nor can I imagine how hard it must have been for these young children to leave everything that they knew behind. We are so lucky today to be able to hear firsthand testimony from 4 local Holocaust survivors that were saved through this program. We have a very full schedule, and I want to make sure we get the maximum amount of time to hear from them. So I'm going to get right to acknowledgments and inviting up our special guests. So first, thank you to Queensborough Community College for supporting this and all of our programs, projects, and exhibitions, especially our new interim president, Dr. Timothy Lynch, and vice president for institutional advancement, Ms. Rosemary Sullivan-Zins. On behalf of President Lynch, I'd like to invite up Dr. Sandra Palmer, the Acting Vice President for Academic Affairs, to say a few words. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Sandra Palmer. I am the Acting Vice President for Academic Affairs, and on behalf of President Lynch and the college, welcome to the 80th year remembrance of the Kindertransport of 1938 to 1940. I understand Melissa Hacker, President of the Kindertransport Association, will provide a brief history shortly. However, I want to say how remarkable it is to think that due to the kindness and generosity of Great Britain and its citizens, and genuine concern for the safety of children, particularly Jewish children, at the outbreak of World War II, 10,000 children were transported from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to Great Britain. Although 10,000 may seem insignificant compared to the millions of people who died in the Holocaust, it certainly is not. The lives of these children were saved, and today we celebrate this extraordinary period in history. And I am very grateful to be here today. This is a wonderful story, and I know all of you look forward to hearing the stories of our survivors here, and I hope you enjoy the event, and again, welcome to Queensborough Community College.
Thank you. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center would not be able to bring our community rich programming and innovative original exhibitions without the continued support of our local elected officials. As such, I would like to invite up Ms. Casey Leisicki, representative from Assembly Member David Weprin's office and Queensborough Community College alumni.
Hello. My name is Casey Leisicki. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff for Assembly Member David Weprin and QCC Class of 2012. The Assemblyman had delivered the following remarks on the anniversary of Kristallnacht on November 4th, and he asked for me to share with you his remarks today. Exactly 80 years ago, despicable acts of state-sponsored violence and intimidation were carried out against German Jews. This event, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of the Shattered Glass, was carried out by the evil of the Nazis who targeted and destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, synagogues, and cemeteries. 267 synagogues were destroyed, and over 90 Jews were killed. Reflecting back on the event, historians now consider this the turning point from when rhetoric turned to violence that eventually begot the Holocaust. I was saddened and appalled to learn 11 Jews were killed when a gunman opened fire to peaceful worshipers at the Tree of Life Congregation Synagogue. The gunman, an anti-Semite, was fueled by the hate speech coming from our own government. Words have consequences, and those who speak hate are responsible for the resulting violence. We must stand united against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. We cannot let this be our turning point from rhetoric to violence. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and murder committed against one group is a murder committed against all of humanity. We must let our fellow community members and political leaders know that hate is unacceptable, and it was not acceptable 80 years ago, and it will not be tolerated now. Diversity is our strength, and we will continue to live, work, and worship together as a united community. Thank you.
As we recognize our supporters, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Bibi Bernstein for supporting this and all the events in this year's Doctors Bibi and Owen Bernstein Lecture Series. We are grateful for your ongoing support of our public programs. Next, I'm honored to welcome up Mr. Anthony Phillipson, British Consul General in New York. Mr. Phillipson was appointed as Her Majesty's Consul General in November 2017, and he has also served as Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America since February 2018.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an enormous privilege and genuinely humbling to be invited to this event. I know there was another event that I was also invited to on Sunday, which unfortunately I couldn't make, and my apologies, but I've been hearing a little bit about it this morning and it sounds fantastic. But as I say, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and it was a privilege to spend a few moments before this event with some of the survivors of the Kindertransport, to hear their stories and to help honour their legacy, but also to hear about their experiences as they left the countries in Europe just before the war and made their way to the UK. The importance of events like this, it seems to me, are because not enough people know about the story of the Kindertransport. I was saying that I was in Singapore 5 years ago when we did an event to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Kindertransport, and I think it is safe to say that not very many people, probably even in the British High Commission in Singapore, knew about the Kindertransport until I told them about it. And I probably didn't know enough about it until I researched the Kindertransport in order to prepare for that event. And the importance of it, and as we will hear later, is that if we don't tell the stories and if we don't pass on the memories, then they pass on with those who lived them. And if we allow that to happen, then we allow the risk of making the mistake of allowing events to repeat themselves. I think it was Mark Twain who said that history may not repeat itself, but it occasionally rhymes. And as we heard, there are still too many instances in the world today of acts of violence done within communities, and certainly too many acts of violence against the Jewish community. And the events in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago were horrific. What they tend to do, though, is, as with the events of Kristallnacht, prompting the Kindertransport, although, as you absolutely rightly say, the other events that ensued, genuinely appalling, horrific, it doesn't outweigh them, it just means we need to remember the positives. After Pittsburgh, we saw another extraordinary event with the show up for Shabbat, as people from all faiths turned out at synagogues the following weekend to show their solidarity with the Jewish community. And as I remarked in a meeting that I had with the AJC in New York a few weeks ago, we sometimes, we celebrate the positives like the Kindertransport or show up for Shabbat, but of course they are always prompted by horrific acts. And those are the ones that we must remember, those are the ones that we must make sure people understand the origins of these events. And that's why it's so important that we do events like this here today. So, as I say, it's a privilege to be here. I'll be honest, I'm very proud of the role that the UK played, and in particular individuals played in making the Kindertransport happen. We didn't save enough, but as I say, if we tell the stories, remember the memories of those who went before us, and hope that we can find ways of working better as communities, within communities, between communities of all faiths, we can stop these events repeating themselves. So thank you again for inviting me. I'm looking forward to hearing the memories and the stories of the survivors. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the British Consulate for coming. I'm pleased to invite up Ms. Melissa Hacker, president of the Kindertransport Association. Ms. Hacker is also a filmmaker, and this November we screened her documentary, My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports, a film that told, above all, the story of her mother, Ruth Morley, one of the 10,000 children who was saved. Ms. Hacker will give us some background history on what the Kindertransports were and how they came to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marissa. And thank you to the Kindertransport person who drove me out here. So I have been asked today to speak on the history of the Kindertransports, which is a rescue mission without which I would not be here today. My mother fled Vienna on a Kindertransport in January 1939. And as we've heard, the Kindertransport was conceived in response to the events of Kristallnacht, November 9, 1938. And I want to start by saying that November 9 was not a night of crystal, which is the direct translation of Kristallnacht, something that sounds almost beautiful. November 9, 1938 was a pogrom in the tradition of violent, state-mandated action against Jews. November 9 was a turning point. It marked the beginning of the end. After this public violence, it was impossible to believe in a positive future for the Jewish community in Germany. This series of violent attacks against Jews was a major escalation in the Nazis' increasingly violent campaign. But I want to go back to another turning point a few months earlier, the Evian Conference. How many people here have heard of the Evian Conference? Okay, so for a number of you, I'm talking about something new, which is a good thing always. So in July 1938, the US President Franklin Roosevelt called for an international conference to discuss the growing Jewish refugee crisis. Delegates from 32 countries met in the resort town of Evian, France. During this 9-day meeting, delegates formally expressed sympathy for the refugees and sorrow that their nations were unable to do more in the present situation. Most countries, including the United States and Great Britain, offered excuses for not letting in more refugees. The Dominican Republic was the only country that agreed to accept Jewish refugees. Rafael Trujillo, in an effort to improve his international reputation, granted visas to 1,000 Jews who were to live in Sosua, a special community established for them. And if anyone's curious about that, you can look online. There's a very odd little newsreel about that community that you can watch through the U.S. Holocaust Museum's archives. In July 1938, months after Hitler's troops had marched into and annexed Austria as part of the new Greater Germany, and the anti-Semitic laws that had been developed and enforced in Germany over 5 years were immediately applied in Austria, the world stood by. The Evian Conference showed that there was little help available for Jews trying to escape. Life would go on as usual elsewhere in the world. No extraordinary action would be taken to help the Jews trapped in Hitler's Germany. It was only after November 9 that action was taken. After November 9, British Jews and Quakers working with Jewish communities in Germany acted quickly and petitioned members of British Parliament to take in Jewish refugees. Debates were held in Parliament only days later on November 17 and November 21, 1938. So I'm just going to read a few short excerpts from that debate, which was just reenacted in Parliament this year on the 80th anniversary of the date of the initial debates. So Noel Baker asked, Dr. Goebbels would like us to think that this is a domestic question, that it is no concern of ours how his government treats the racial and religious minorities within their state. He said the other day that he hoped the outside world would soon forget the German Jews. He hopes in vain. His campaign against them will go down in history as a lasting memory of human shame. Let there be with it another memory of what other nations did to wipe the shame away. Commander Sir Archibald Southby said, "Space can be found in the world to accommodate these people, but in our desire to help this stream of refugees, we must not lose sight of the fact that there exists in the minds of many of our own people a very real fear lest there should be a tremendous influx into this country of refugees who are unable to maintain themselves and who would have to compete with our own citizens for livelihood. Our first duty is to our own people." The Secretary of State for the Home Department, Samuel Hoare, said, "With these Jewish and non-Aryan children, I believe we could find homes in this country for a very large number without any harm to our own population. I could not help thinking what a terrible dilemma it was to the Jewish parents in Germany to have to choose between sending their children to a foreign country into the unknown and continuing to live in the terrible conditions to which they are now reduced in Germany." Captain Shaw, have we asked the Home Secretary the duration of time that Jewish children are to be allowed to remain in this country and whether he will see that steps are taken to keep track of them and arrange for their leaving this country at a fixed age? Mr. Lloyd, it is proposed that the refugee children admitted to this country under the care of the Inter-Aid Committee for Children may be permitted to remain in this country for purely educational and training purposes until they have completed their education or training on condition that they are not placed in ordinary employment. A record will be kept of each individual child. The Kindertransport scheme was approved. Visa requirements were waived, and temporary transit documents would be created and given to children who would travel to safety in Britain unaccompanied by their parents. The plan was that the children would rejoin their parents elsewhere when it was safe. The first Kindertransport left Berlin on December 1, 1938. There are two lesser-known actions that were taken in direct response to November 9 that I want to mention. Feng Shanho, the Chinese consul general in Vienna, was ordered to stop issuing visas to China. He ignored this order and continued to issue them to anyone who asked for one, even if they were not intending to go to China. He was aware that Jews could leave Germany only if they had a visa to enter another nation, so he helped provide that. Robert Smallbones, the British consul general in Frankfurt, Germany, asked the Home Office to provide a temporary haven for Jews who would eventually go to the United States under the quota system. So the quota allowing refugees to the USA was very low and kept unfilled so that people waited, desperate for their numbers to come up. This, in fact, was what happened with my grandparents, that my mother and my grandmother were on the Austrian quota to the US, and they could have left in 1938. But my grandfather was on the Polish quota, and my grandmother refused to leave without him. So they put my mother on a Kindertransport and waited in Vienna for my grandfather's number to the US to come up. So under the Smallbones scheme, people could leave Germany and wait in Britain for their turn to enter the United States. Smallbones issued visas until September 3rd, 1939, the day the British declared war on Germany. When he returned to Britain, he learned that nearly 48,000 people had benefited from his project and that another 50,000 had been under consideration when the war broke out. British officials insisted that Smallbones and others keep this a secret, and it was not revealed until 2009. So, in the US, in February 1939, Senator Robert Wagner of New York and Representative Edith Rogers of Massachusetts sponsored a bill based on the Kindertransports, which had then been running successfully to Great Britain for several months. Wagner and Rogers wanted Congress to temporarily admit 20,000 Jewish children until it was safe for them to return home or wherever they would go. It was explained that most of these children were too young to work, so they would not take jobs from Americans, and that their stay would not cost taxpayers a cent, as Jewish groups had agreed to assume financial responsibility for them. However, Gallup, which was a polling organization, began asking Americans, it has been proposed to bring to this country 20,000 refugee children from Germany, most of them Jewish, to be taken care of in American homes. Should the government permit these children to come in? 61% responded that the government should not permit the children to come into this country. The wife of the U.S. Commissioner of Immigration warned that these 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow into 20,000 ugly adults, and the bill was killed in committee. And it's always strange to me as I read this. This is a story of history, and there's so much that I think we can all relate to as is happening now. There aren't direct parallels, but there's many similarities. So the Kindertransports ran from December 1st, 1938. Because what I want to say, our immigration numbers are now at their lowest point in many, many years. The quotas are being kept very, very low. The Kindertransports ran from December 1st, 1938 through August 1939. The lives of nearly 10,000 children were saved. Most never saw their parents again. When we think of the Kindertransports, we must also think of the courageous parents who sent their children far away without phone lines necessarily, without internet, not even reliable letters after a certain point, not knowing who would take care of them, and not knowing what would happen to them, the parents, and the rest of the family, trapped still. And we also must think of all the children who were not rescued by the Kindertransports. 1.5 million children were murdered. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that detailed history, and thank you for all you do to preserve this important history for future generations. Because this is the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransports, we wanted to do something very special, so we've invited the Astoria Music Project, a group of local musicians, to perform. This is the first concert in their American Experience season, and today they will explore the music of composers who made America their home, with an emphasis on what it means to leave your homeland behind and start over. They will play 1 or 2 songs now and then end our program with a longer performance. So please join me in welcoming the Astoria Music Project.
Thank you, Marissa. Thank you to Kupferberg Center, and thank you for Queensborough College for having us here today. We're so honored to be a part of this event. As Marissa mentioned, our first of 4 concerts, we wanted to talk about the experience of people who made America their home, even though they were not native born. We start with Kurt Weill, who was born and raised in Germany and rose to prominence as a composer in the 1920s. He began composing opera and was expected to be the next great classical composer, but he actually, during his devotion to musical theater, became really famous throughout Europe due to, especially to his collaboration with Bertolt Brecht. His Jewish heritage, unfortunately, forced him to flee the Nazi regime in 1933. He first escaped to Paris, where he continued to compose for some French cabarets, and then he eventually settled in the U.S. Until his death. His name became synonymous with Broadway, and his works were well performed today. You probably recognize some of them: the Threepenny Opera, Lady in the Dark, Street Scene. A lot of the songs that you probably know and love as American Broadway hits were actually written by Kurt Weill. This piece, which we'll start for you today, Wie lange noch, was a French piece that he had reworked. He was approached by the Office of War Information in 1944 to produce a propaganda piece for World War II. And he rewrote this cabaret song with a new text by a man named Walter Mehring, and they recorded it. He played the piano and recorded it with Lade Lenya, who was a very famous singer, and actually his ex-wife, soon-to-be wife again. They had a very close personal relationship, and they played the song on the radio behind enemy lines in Germany during World War II. And though the lyrics never explicitly mention Hitler or the Nazi regime, the meaning it comes through very clearly. So this is Wie lange noch by Kurt Weill.
Du hast mich geholt.
Thank you. A very famous film composer, Erik Korngold, who was born in what's currently the Czech Republic. He was raised in Vienna, and his father was also a music critic, so he was raised in this very musical European tradition. He was a child prodigy, and he was sort of some people made comparisons to Mozart when they talked about him, because he would tour around Europe, and he gained help of composers like Gustav Mahler and Alexander Zemlinsky. He held really important positions in music theaters and academies in Europe. A number of big works were produced, including 4 operas, before he reached the age of 30. In 1934, he was invited to travel to the US, and he was hired to write incidental music for Max Reinhardt's Midsummer Night's Dream film, and thus began his long career in film music. He attempted to work both in Hollywood and in the classical circuit in Europe until the Anschluss in 1938, when he and his family were forced to flee to the US. Korngold vowed not to write any concert music until Hitler was defeated. He was able to return to Europe later in the 50s and late 40s and 50s, but lived full-time in the US. He found that his homeland has very much changed, and so he decided to make his full-time life in the US. He died in Hollywood in 1957, and he was a multiple Oscar winner, so he's more known for his film music. But our violinist, Rachel Hauser, will play with David Tubman, our pianist, a piece that is another violin piece. It's just for a scene of the garden scene in Much Ado About Nothing. So he has had an affinity for Shakespeare, it seems.
So we've asked the impossible task from our 4 survivors today to very briefly share their experience leading up to and during the Kindertransport. So each survivor will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll continue to learn about their experiences through a number of student questions. So first I'd like to invite up Miss Anita Weissbord. Thank you so much. You want to walk around?
I was born in Vienna, Austria. Austria is the middle of Europe. I had a wonderful childhood. I was the youngest of 3, had loving brother and sister, a lot of aunts and uncles, and I had a wonderful life. That is a school outing, different vacations, and everything a child needs I had. Until the day Hitler marched into Austria on March 13, 1938. That was the end of my childhood, the way I knew it. Overnight, you become a non-person. As you can see, Austrians claimed that they were the victims. Let me tell you, there were no victims. They opened Hitler with open arms. As you can see, the swastika flag is ready. Had the armbands with the swastika. They had to hold the people back. They were so happy, and they had big rallies going along. They were marching on the street and chanting, Hitler awake, Jude verrecke. That means Hitler awake, Jews perish. Now, in Germany, Hitler was already in power for a few years, so every year another law came out. You couldn't go to school, you couldn't go to the theater, movie, couldn't even sit on the bench in a park. This is a picture of the university, where they stood to be sure that no Jew should enter. My cousin was a medical student. He just couldn't go anymore. You just hope that when you leave your house, you come back alive. It was overnight, and as you can see, they had signs, don't buy Jews, and there was a plebiscite just before Hitler marched in, and they had graffiti for different candidates on the floor, and the Jews had to scrub the floors to get rid of it. My mother was picked up. She had to do it. And people watching and spitting at them just make them less than human. And of course, then came Kristallnacht, the night of the broken dice, where they burned most synagogues in Germany and Austria. There was one synagogue in Vienna they could not burn because it was in a small street and attached to houses. So they used this as a stable for their house, for the horses. They came into our home, arrested my father, who ended up in Dachau concentration camp, smashed some furniture and helped themselves to whatever they want. Now you would think you called the police. You couldn't. There were one of them. There was absolutely nothing you could do. My mother realized she has to save her children. She has to do something. My brother was already in his early 20s. His so-called friends were coming for him. So he went to France, he went to Paris. But in Europe, you needed identity papers. Of course, he had none. One day, the French police stopped him, and they were going to send him back. You could just imagine what would happen. So he joined the French he joined the French Foreign Legion and ended up in Africa. When the British, during the war, came to North Africa, he joined the British Army. Now, as I said, my mother went from place to place to save the children. And I don't know how she found out about the Kindertransport, but she registered me there to go. I remember distinctly my aunt, who had 4 children, having a violent argument with my mother. She called my mother a rotten mother. How can you send your children away? How can you do that? Do you know, until I became a mother, did I realize they were both right? What does a mother want to do? Hold you close. But I think my mother gave birth to me twice, when I was born and when she had the strength and the foresight to send me on the Kindertransport. Now, it's very hard for the young people today to realize what it means to leave the country you're born, go to a foreign country. You don't know who's going to take care of you, and what happened to your family. Today, with internet and social media, you know what happens in the world instantly. We didn't have that. I had no idea where England was. Never met an English person before, so it was very scary. I remember the day I left was March 13, 1939. I only remember the date because it was the 1-year anniversary of Hitler marching into Austria. And we were at the train station. It was a sealed train. I'm inside, standing at the window, my mother outside. For 4 agonizing hours, the train stood there. I'm inside, my mother outside. I was afraid to step away from the window because I might lose her forever. That's over 80 years ago, and to this day, I cannot stand anybody seeing me off. I don't remember how many children were there, but they were little ones, 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, who had no idea what happened to them. They just cried for their mothers. And if somebody survived and came from them, they couldn't even remember them. We had to give a list to the Gestapo what we are taking. We were only allowed to take personal belongings, only a small suitcase. And that's how we traveled, from Vienna through Germany, the Hook of Holland, then on the boat over to England. Now in Vienna is this statue where all the trains left, and the one on the other side is at Liverpool Station in London, where all the children arrived. Those are the children arriving, and that is the lady who took me in. Most children had excellent experiences, and the British people really opened up their homes and gave them the love they needed. I know I didn't go through the horror of the camps, but I think any child who has to leave everything behind and not knowing what's happening. As I said, 10,000 children were saved. 90% of all those children never saw their parents again. When I speak to students, I tell them that they are the future. You are the future. It's up to them. It should never happen to another child again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just get this. So next I'd like to invite up Miss Ellen Zilka. Would you?
Thank you for coming. Friends of mine, members of the temple, and I hope there are a lot of students here. I have had the privilege of being interviewed by Queensborough students, and many of them have asked me wonderful questions, and I've told them my story. Well, as Anita's, I had a wonderful home life. I grew up in Berlin, Germany, in a nice middle-class suburb. We were middle-class Jews, observant, not super orthodox, but observant. My mother, as women at that time were, was a homemaker and stayed home. My father was a traveling salesman for a shoe manufacturing company. So he was only home weekends. And I had a brother 5 years younger than myself. And home life was good. We were able to visit my grandparents very often in Cologne, an aunt and uncle that lived in the middle of Germany, beautiful family relationships and holidays. And everything was okay and even good. We did not put out the Hanukkah menorah in the window as we do here. I was not really aware of the political situation except at election time, when there was rowdiness outside on the streets. And of course, we felt there was something going on, something bad. It must have been in early 38 or sometime in 38. We were forced to leave our apartment in the suburb and move to an apartment house in the center of Berlin, where we had to share the apartment with another Jewish couple. I don't remember much about it, except it was hard for my mother to have to share the kitchen and make meals. And it was at this time that all of a sudden my father was home with us all the time. So obviously he was no longer able to pursue his job. And my parents were now trying to get visas and leave the country. And at this point, to prepare for it, my father tried to learn Spanish. My mother tried to learn to sew and make candy as a livelihood in the future. Unfortunately, of course, they never got visas, never got out. They somehow heard about the Kindertransport and put both our names on it. And my brother left early July 39. I left 3 weeks later. It was July 25. It was the 9th of Av, a day of sadness in our calendar. I left, of course, from Berlin. Berlin being a big city with good transportation. I said goodbye to my parents at one station. Of course, it was very, very sad. We did not sit there for 4 hours. We sat there for a very short time. My parents were able to jump on the underground, and I fleetingly saw them at the next station where we picked up more children. Of course, we went through Holland, had the Channel crossing, which was very rough. I don't remember much about landing in England, but I do remember my first arrival in the future place where I lived, which was in the country, in Gloucestershire, so I escaped the horrors of World War II. My brother had been sent to a Jewish couple in the north of England. We were able to visit each other. I went and spent Passover with them every Pesach. So I had a wonderful education, and I was able to come to America in 46 due to my mother's 2 sisters and cousin who survived, made a visa for me, and made me possible to come to America, get a wonderful education, and a beautiful, happy married life. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to call out Mr. Manfred Korman.
Good afternoon. Story is not quite the same. We ended up in the same Kindertransport, not quite the same. My family history started in October well, started before October 28, 1938, but the event started October 28, 38, when the Hitler regime decided to send all what we call Ostjuden from Eastern Europe, from Poland, out of the country, because the Polish government had decided that if there was somebody living outside of Poland who was living in Germany, if they don't come back, then they would not be able to come back. So Hitler decided at that moment, we'll get them back to you. And so on October 28, 38, and if you check your calendars, it was a Friday, they picked us up at 7 o'clock in the morning, the police did, and walked us to the local police station. And then from the local police station, they took us on lorries to the Hamburg prison. And in the prison, they separated women with children and husbands and fathers. And we did not get together until the end of the day, when they collected us again and took us to the Hamburg railroad station. And at the Hamburg railroad station, the fathers and husbands were reunited with their children and their mothers. So, first reaction of a child of 6.5 years old is, what am I doing here? And wondering what's next. So they put us on the trains at Hamburg Railroad Station. And there's one image I'll never forget. We walked onto the train, and there was someone we knew with a Kiddush cup in his hand, making Kiddush because it was Shabbat. I mean, these are unusual times, but people do some very interesting things. Anyway, those trains were also somewhat sealed. The top window was open, but that was it. The train then left Hamburg, went through Berlin, and at that station, my mother attempted to send a card to tell her parents, who lived in Elberfeld, Germany, that what was happening. And she pushed a card that she had written out to a guy on the station through that opening crack. And as the train pulled out, he just tore it up and threw it away. So that gives you some image of what the thinking was already in October 38 in Hamburg and Berlin. So the train ended up the next morning at the German-Polish border. And at the German-Polish border, the German side was at that time called Neubenchen, and the Polish town was called Spongin. Spongin, they still exist, except the map has been drawn somewhat differently after World War II. So at that border, the Germans then marched us to the Polish, right at the pass that says, you're now leaving Germany, you're going to Poland. And they came in back of us with weapons and pushed us forward. And by the way, we were not alone on this train. This was a train full of people under the same set of circumstances. And the Poles were on the other side with weapons, not wanting us to come in. My father said to us, stay back. And so we were toward the back. And then somebody started to run across the border. And when that happened, everybody else ran across the border. The Poles had no clue that we were arriving, other than rumor mills. And so where do you put all these people? Because we were coming from Berlin and Frankfurt and Leipzig and Hamburg, Germany, and so on and so forth. Well, they put us into horse stables. Horses out, humans in. And on straw. And that's where we were. And then accommodations had to be made, and people had to decide where does food come from and so on and so forth. Well, there were organizations that were functioning immediately, getting food to us, and I think Joint was one of them, and making certain that the basics are there for us. My father, being considered a Pole, was able to rent a room in a Scheuchert's house in Spongin. So he figured if he could have more opportunities to move around and get things and take care of the family. My mother, my brother, and I, my mother was born in Germany, my brother and I were born in Germany. We did not have, the Germans considered us Polish because our father was Polish. The Poles only considered my father as the Pole, and the rest of us were Germans. So we had to stay in that area. They moved us from the horse stables to what was called Die Mühle, the windmill, and they did not have beds for us. They had mats on the floors, and that's where we stayed until such time as my father was able to get us out, and we moved together onto a farm area in a little town called Nonia, which is right outside of Spongin, smaller than Spongin, and Spongin was pretty small. And we lived in this one room in this farmhouse. In April of 1939, my father was given the right to return to Germany to close out our household in Hamburg. And he did that. And that was a very different kind of separation. My father was not the schmaltziest guy in the world. And when he left on the train from Spongin, he waved with both hands. And even as a child, I knew that's not my father. Something different is happening. And so my father went back to Germany, and while he was in Germany, he received a visa from a friend of his in Cuba, and he ends up on the ship to St. Louis. And so my father leaves the decision had to be made between my father and my mother. Do I go or come back to you? And so on and so forth. And the decision was made he would go. And hopefully he could then get to the US, and then we would all be together. Well, as you know, the story of the St. Louis, I won't go into it. My father ended up in Holland, and he survived concentration camp Weissbord, which is in Holland, and that's where all the Jews of Holland went, and Frank and all the other important personalities that you know of through the literature. So that's where my father came. My mother knew she had to get rid of her children out of Poland because war was hovering all over the place. And so she found out about Kindertransport. And so decisions had to be made. There was talk about Palestine. There was talk about going to England. My mother said, whatever comes first, that's what's going to happen. So England came first. And in June of 39, we went on this train. What your parents felt, my mother felt. How do you get kids? How do you leave your children? How do you put them on a train and so on and so forth? Well, we had one case of a woman who put a boy on and took him off and put him on and took him off, and she finally let him go because somebody said, you're saving your child, let him go. That has a long history, that kid, who attached himself to us later on. So we ended up taking the train to Warsaw, and then they collected us in a town outside of Warsaw called Otwock. And in fact, my brother, who's a historian, found a historian in England who had a picture of our group, which was the group of us who were collected to go on the Kindertransport And most of them did go on the Kindertransport. So we were collected in Odvodsk, and we stayed there. It was not supposed to be as long as it occurred. It was a drag, because we got there in June, and we should have left somewhere in July, and we didn't leave until August 24. Out of Odvodsk, they collected us, going to Warsaw, and then from Warsaw, the train took us to Gdynia, and our ship went from Gdynia, North Sea, and to England. Not all of us from this group were able to go. They had so many arrangements had to be made for homes to accept youngsters. That was, I think, part of the deal for the British government. And some youngsters' names were not called. And my brother, who's a historian, said September 1, that place was bombed, and the rest of the crowd was gone. So we survived that portion. Just one more thing about that trip. My mother, when she put us on the Kindertransport, she wangled her way back to Germany. And my brother, who's older than I, said to the authorities who were in charge of us, by the way, none of our parents are here anymore. Not my father, not my mother. My brother just thought they should know what was going on. I don't think it made one damn bit of difference, but so it went. We all survived. My mother came first, my brother and I came second, and my father, who survived the concentration camp, arrived in 1946. And so the separation was from 39 to 46, and then we became a family.
Okay, last but not least, I'd like to invite up Ms. Hannah Deutsch.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to repeat all the things that happened to us the same. So I'm going to start with the Kindertransport when the train got to the border of Holland and the police got us off. Not the police, the Nazis got me off. I was 16 years old and the oldest on the train. And they strip searched me. And they told me, if you don't hurry up, the train's going to leave without you. Well, I made it. And we got to Holland, and we had 12 babies under 1 year with us, and one bachelor leader. And I took care of the children. I tucked in each and every one on the boat at night. And we got to England, and we brought all the children up on deck. And I can't believe it. The British were wonderful, but they wouldn't touch any of us until they got the okay from the medical side. So there was a double-decker bus outside. It took us to Harwich. And Harwich was a big hall, and loads of people, and tables spread out with goodies for the children. And our identification was a rope around our neck with a cardboard with a number on it. So here you have 150 children trying to put them together with strangers. They knew me already, so they hung on to my skirt. They didn't want to go. But finally, after a while, everybody was gone, and I was standing in that big hall all alone. I said, "Dear God, what now?" It took 15 minutes, and somebody came to pick me up, took me to a boarding house, and in the morning I had to go to the committee house. How did I get on that Kindertransport? My great aunt had a cousin who was in charge of the Kindertransport in London, and she put me on a list. But she didn't know what kind of list she put, because our transport was children going to family and children going to foster care. And I didn't belong anywhere. I was a child of the committee. I was interviewed and asked what I would like to do. And I said, well, I always wanted to be a medical doctor, but I know that is not possible. But if it's possible, I would like to stay in the medicine and become a nurse. And that's what happened. They put me into a hospital as a probationary nurse. September 1 came along, and war was declared, and London cleaned out. Schools were evacuated to Scotland and Wales. Hospitals were evacuated. My hospital went to Bognor Regis, which is at the seaside. Now, anyone who wasn't born in England had to go to tribunal. And I went to the tribunal, and they made me an enemy alien because I was located where I wasn't supposed to be. They came and they took me back to London. I was in the hostel there for a few days, and they came and they shipped me out to the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man was a haven for me, because at this time the Battle of Britain was starting, and the Isle of Man never knew that there was a war. I was able to work in the hospital, to continue my studies in the hospital, and after 1 year there was a second tribunal. And I finally was cleared, but I couldn't go back to London. I had to go to Manchester. So I went to Manchester to a hostel there. I finished in Manchester. I took my examinations and I got my RN. And then I thought, what am I going to do now? And then I said, England saved my life. I've got to thank England that I joined the British Army. And then later I was stationed in London, where I wasn't allowed to go in the first place. Okay. In 1942, we had a Jewish Forces Club in London where everybody met. And I tell you, there wasn't an army that wasn't there, from the Palestinian army to every army. And all we could do was speak Yiddish, because nobody could understand the next person if they came from somewhere. I met a Canadian soldier, and we later got engaged, and we got married in November of 43. With the marriage, I became automatically a Canadian citizen. Having been born in Germany and having your nationality taken away and become stateless. And in England, they saw me like a limey, as they called me, because I really spoke like a limey. I automatically became a Canadian citizen. It's not today anymore. Today, they have to be in Canada for 3 to 5 years. I became pregnant and was cast out of the army. And I had 6 weeks to get to Canada because the ruling was you had to be in your first part of your pregnancy, or you had to have the baby in England. They were afraid something might happen. Well, I made it. And when we got engaged and we wrote it to the family, they sent me pictures and welcome to the family, and it was wonderful. I don't want to tell you, I don't have the time to, the trip on the boat with an escort of ships through minefields, I saw the times that I would never get there because I spent the whole trip in the hospital, of course, like all the other pregnant women. And when we got to Montreal, when we got to Halifax, we got on the train, a Pullman train, and it took us to London, and the families were waiting there, and the names were called, and I saw the people get up, and I saw these poor women with children, and they hardly got a handshake, because the British are wonderful people, but they're very reserved. And when they called my name, and I went out, the whole family was there with open arms, and as if I left there and I was coming home from the war. So that was my second family, because my first one was killed. All people from my area. I was born in Düsseldorf in 1922, and when I was 2 years old, we moved to Bochum, which was in Westphalia. And the whole area of Westphalia all went to Riga. Riga was never mentioned. There are so many concentration camps that were never mentioned that you're only finding, even to this day, they're finding more and more. And this was a new family. It was wonderful. Unfortunately, it's many years ago, and they're all gone. So then, with my children, I came here, and it is now my third family of my daughter-in-law's family. So I'm very lucky, because I've had a very, very lonely life. So this is made up for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. We're going to invite the survivors back up. I'm just going to move this. So thank you all so much for sharing your stories. So this semester, Dr. Eliza Atig, Assistant Professor of English here at Queensborough Community College, is teaching English 263, which is Holocaust literature. So during the course of the semester, students learned about the Holocaust, and specifically this year about the Kindertransport. As an assignment, students prepared detailed and well-researched questions for the survivors. And many of the students are here with us today, so if you can try and maybe make your way a little bit closer, that would be great. I have all the questions from the students, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the student's name. If the student is here, they'll come. I'll give them the mic. They'll ask the question. If they're not here, I will read the question. Okay? And so each question will be asked to a specific survivor. So each will have 3 questions, and then I have 2 questions for the entire group. Okay? So we're going to start with Jacob Alon. Okay, great. I can just hand you the mic if you want. Okay.
Hi. What were the belongings you were allowed to bring onto the Kindertransport? Do you still have any of those items?
Take it off. Can we take this off? Can we take this off, please?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. There we go.
The question was, of all the items you were allowed to take, do you still have some of them?
Yes.
I kept many of them a long time, and then I gave them to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., because they like artifacts. And of course, I had clothing and a doll and books and stuff. But what my mother packed, and I really don't know why, was household items, a blanket, towels, a beautiful damask tablecloth with napkins that was part of her trousseau. And she sewed name tapes into everything because she explained to me that we were not allowed to bring new stuff into the country because Germany didn't want us to make a livelihood out of it. So if there was a name tag in, it was the equivalent of having been used. And of course, as I said, I had clothing and stuff.
Great, thank you. Kayla Amberley? Okay. Should just say who the question is for.
Hi. Did they let you observe Shabbat or certain other holidays?
No, when the lady who took me in, I could not practice my religion because she wanted me to be with her. I went to church twice on Sunday, and it was beautiful. The people were kind. And once I see the people who took the children in were responsible until they're 18 years of age. And after that, I went to London. I had to make a life for myself, and then I could go back to my religion. And, you know, I always said that if I would have been younger and not come from a traditional Jewish home, it would have been so easy. A new country, a new language, why not a new religion? But I was old enough, I was 15. I knew who I was, so it was much easier than for the very young ones.
Great. Jennifer Cachavalli? Great, okay. Oh, there. She got a mic. Oh, okay. This question is for Hannah Deutsch. Thank you. Well.
Hi. Even after you escaped your country, did you feel safe in Great Britain?
After you escaped your country, did you feel safe in Great Britain?
Absolutely. I think the years that I spent in England, and especially the ones in the army, were the best years of my life, because I felt England was one for all and all for one. We were so united. Nobody asked, what religion are you or what are you? You're there. When the air sirens went, everybody saw that your neighbor got into the shelter. There was no anti-Semitism. The only thing, and I'm going to give you a laugh, that I encountered, I was in the army, and I was a company nurse, and we were sitting around the fireplace, and all of them knew that I was Jewish, because I had Shabbat off. And I didn't have to go on church parade on Sunday. And it was never mentioned. We were just the same. We had a new girl that came from, I don't know, way out a small town, and she befriended me. And one day she made a remark, while we were all sitting together, she said, "I hate the Jews." And everybody looked at me and looked at her. And then I asked her, I said, "Why do you hate the Jews?" No, I said to her, you befriended me. You're my friend. Why do you say that? I'm Jewish. She said, "Oh, no, you're not." I said, "But why do you hate Jews? Do you know any Jews?" She says, "No." She said, "Jews have horns." Okay? That's long gone, but it was still around in those years.
Yes.
Thank you.
This question is from Leo Maris Diaz. Okay. It's for Manny.
Hello, good afternoon. My question for you is, did you keep a strong relationship with your Kindertransport foster parents after the Holocaust?
Let's see, we left there in September of 40. And my mother in 1950 went to England and made contact with that family. We kept in touch mail-wise for a while. We all became somewhat non-writers, but we kept in touch that way for a while. Then my mother went to to England to see her brother, and she then went out to Devonshire to visit the family that took care of us. Then my brother went there, and then a few years later I followed. So we've kept in touch that way. My brother and I went there in '91, and the women of the family who took care of us, there was a mother and a daughter, they were gone. But as we drove up to that farmhouse in this little town of Tallaton, we're not sure, and then we became sure. We suddenly asked somebody, "Is this Rose Cottage?" And that somebody says, "Yes, this is Rose Cottage." And he looks at me, he says, "Are you Manfred?" And I said, "I am." He and I played together when we were kids in Devonshire, and he was growing up he was part of the family. Mm-hmm. So yes, we kept contact.
The next question is from Reed Philly. Yeah? Okay. So this is for Ellen, this question.
Hello. My question is, if you were in your parents' shoes, would you have done the same for your child and send them off?
Thank you. He asked if I was in my parents' shoes, if I'd do the same. And of course, I've been thinking about that, as Anita said in her talk. When I had kids, would one do it? And I think my parents did it out of desperation. They finally realized, that the family would never get out of the country, and that's the only thing they could do. And I just want to put in, because my parents never knew this, but I must tell you about my brother. He was only 5 years old. I didn't know they took him as young as 2. But at a 5-year-old, being taken away from your parents, it was super traumatic for him. He was taken in by a very nice family, a Jewish childless family that raised him, but he always had problems with relationship, and it has affected him all his life. Unfortunately, through circumstances, he was always separated from the environment that he was familiar with. And as an adult, he had financial problems that he could not handle, and he'd had medical, emotional problems. And at the young age of 73, he took his life. And we say he was a victim of Hitler. And I'm only telling you because it's part of the Kindertransport story.
I know I spoke to a lot of kinder who were 5 or 6 years old. And if their parents survived, they could never have a real relationship again, because the mother still treated them like they're 5 years old, and they were already teenagers. So it was always a very hard, they grow up as nice English boys and girls, and all of a sudden they are pulled back into their old life, which they didn't even want anymore. So the scars were always there. You know, we talked about before religion. I speak to students. One student asked me, "Do you wish you wouldn't be Jewish?" So I had to think for a moment. I said, no, because Hitler wanted to get rid of all of us, and I'm still here, and I'm proud of who I am. I don't want Hitler to win. And I told the students, wherever you are, be proud of who you are and just respect each other. I felt this is what I have to tell them. We always tell them not to be bystanders. When something happens, speak up, you students. You're the future. You should see that those things should not happen, because hate is like a cancer. If you don't stop it, it spreads.
Thank you.
The next question is from Lucas Garces. Oh, okay. And this is for, who's it for? Ellen? Hannah. For Hannah Deutsch. This question is for you, Hannah.
For you. Hello, how are you? Have you returned to your homeland after the war, and what are your feelings towards your homeland?
Have you returned to your homeland? And what did you think?
A very good question. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I was instigating in getting my hometown to invite the survivors. It took a few years. The day came. And we were there, we were allowed to bring an escort. I took my son with me, my younger son. It was unbelievable, but I don't want to go into that. What I want to go into is that I was thinking a long time, do I want to go back? And then I came to the decision, I don't want to go back and see all those, many it was like 2 generations later. This was 1997. I say, but I want to see the survivors, because in my town, everybody went to our shul Friday night and Saturday. We were like one big family. So I decided to go. They asked me if I would speak in the school, and I said yes. I'd been speaking about the Holocaust since I retired in the 80s. And I wanted to talk to the children. But how am I going to start? What? My brain was working overtime and nothing came. But what came was, in the evening before, was a teacher with 2 girls. And one of the girls asked me, she said, can you tell me my grandmother is raising me. When I asked her anything about that period of time, she never gives me an answer. I didn't tell her that she was a Nazi, but I told her, I will give you the answer tomorrow. And I said, thank you, God, you gave me an opening. I got to the school, and we were sitting around with the press there and the professors there, and it was quite overwhelming. And I looked at every child around me before I started speaking. And then I came back to this girl. And at that time, before I give you the answer, at that time, teenagers were going to Israel, to the kibbutzim during summer vacation, because they felt guilty what their parents had done, or grandparents. And I looked at each one and I said, none of you have to feel guilty to what happened 2 generations before you were even born. And all I heard was, it was like a load off their mind. That's your answer. Thank you.
I'm going to put an addendum on that. My brother and I went there to England, to Germany in '91, into Hamburg. And my brother, who's older than I and much more affected, he was much more affected by what occurred than I, because I was 6.5 when we started. He ran into the problem, my brother, that everywhere he looked, he was trying to identify if that person was involved in 1938 when we were thrown out. I finally had to say to him, you know, that person was about 2 years old, and so on. So that's the reaction going back.
I forgot to tell you that after this trip, I was invited twice more. Only this time it wasn't in the school, it was in the theater. And the professors brought the classes to one time, and one time it was open to the public.
She gave me permission. This question, you know, applies, I think, to all of us. Okay. I heard about the fact that Berlin would invite us if we want to come back, courtesy of the city of Berlin. I'd heard of it. Many people from now Israel went. I kept putting it off. I just couldn't go back. But finally, in 1996, my daughter-in-law's mother, who also came from Berlin, put in an application. And I said, you know, maybe my husband and I should go. She did all the paperwork because her German was better than mine. And we were both invited back to Berlin in 1997. They went in May, and we went in September. We were treated royally, shown around. We had a medical escort because we were all in our 70s. They were afraid we'd be overcome with emotion. We had free time. We were shown places of Jewish interest. Again, my feelings were, I'm just going there, take advantage of them, helping them assuage their guilt. That's what I felt. And we went for the week, and we came right back. My husband and I were able to do a lot of traveling, and finally, in 2000, around 10, we started taking river cruises, and I said, you know, my mother's side of the family came from Western Germany. Jewish history goes back there to the Middle Ages. People mention cities where my grandparents came from. We're taking a Rhine cruise. Make a long story short, we made a Rhine cruise. We stopped at all the towns that had Jewish significance. We saw cemeteries, Judengasse, the street of Jews. We saw a mikveh in one town, a museum. And then the year later, we took a river cruise to the Western Germany, where we saw parts of Germany where my father came from. The trip ended in Prague. We stopped on the way at Theresienstadt. And when we were in Berlin, we saw the house of the Wannsee Conference. And that's it. So it became memorable. I never told my brother about our trip because he would have been upset. And yet when I finally told him, he said, "You do what's good for you, and I do what's good for me."
I was invited back to Vienna, and I went, and they tried to show us how beautiful it is to live there. But all the memories came back, walking in the street. I went to the house where I was born, and then I went to the Stadtpark. It's like Central Park. And I sat on the bench, and I saw some writing on the bench. I jumped up like crazy. I remember saying, "Juden verboten, Jews not allowed." All it said, property of Vienna. But for me, it brought back, nowhere else would I have that feeling that the memories came back. And then I was invited to come back to speak to high school kids. I spoke to high school children in Vienna. That was in 2005. It was already the third generation. And the young people are different, but I met a young lady and I asked her, "Did you ever ask your grandparents what they did during the war?" She said, "I did. All they told me, very bad times. They wouldn't talk about it." So the memories are there. We cannot forget them. And some student online asked me, "Do you hate them?" I said, if I would hate them, I would be as bad as they are. But I never forget and never forgive.
Great, thank you so much. This question's from Daniel Weiser. Okay, so this is from Manny. You want me to read it? Okay, save some time, thank you. So Manny, what kind of picture did your parents create for you, or your mom create for you, about how great and safe life would be in England?
I don't remember that picture being drawn for me at all. You can't really do that. Let me think. My mother was a realist. We had gone through what we had gone through already, having been pushed out and so on and so forth. So the world was not great for us to begin with. The thought that she had was, it can't be worse. And so I've got to get my kids out of here. And so that's what she did. But I have absolutely no memory of ever hearing, "The sun shines better there than somewhere else." That did not happen.
Okay, great, thank you. This question is from Helen Peralta. Okay, great. This question is for Ellen Zilka. Thanks, Jen. Okay.
Do you still keep in touch with the friends you met during the Kindertransport?
Not with the children I met in the Kindertransport, because I was fortunate. I was never in a hostel or anything like that. But I did keep in touch, somewhat similar to the other person. I kept very much in touch with the people that I was with in England. The people that took me in, I corresponded, then of course they died. But the friends I made, I've always been in touch. In fact, I talked to one of them a week ago. One of them visited us in the US, and my daughter and I visited them when we went to England. Yes, we've kept in touch. And those friends made life tolerable for me, because I'll just add quickly, I was not in a family. A wonderful lady, a retired hospital administrator, took me in, and she was the head of a convalescent home for ladies. These ladies were middle-aged, but to me, a 10-year-old, they were ancient. And we lived in rural England without electrification, et cetera, so my neighbors who had a daughter of my age and my school friends were my support group.
Great, thank you. This next question is from Jonathan Young. Okay, this is for Anita.
Hello, my question is, how was your life in your new home different from where you used to live?
Sure, how is your life different in the new home than it was where you used to live?
You mean my home life was entirely different than my life in England? First of all, I had to learn the language. I don't remember how long it took me to learn the language. But then everything, even the food was different. Everything was different. I remember we had those tiny little thin sandwiches and had high tea, and I remember holding my hands under the table. I could have taken the whole plate and eat it. I was always hungry, but I had to be in my best behavior because I was afraid they might send me back. So it was a big adjustment, but at least we were free. We were in a good country. The people were wonderful. They opened up their homes for us and gave us what we needed. For that, I'm forever grateful.
This question is from Victor Persault. Is he here? Okay, I'm going to skip it then. Adam Madramuthu. Great. So this is for Manny.
Good afternoon. My question today is, when arriving to England, did you feel any discrimination in schools or public places?
Can you just read it once more?
When arriving to England, did you feel any discrimination in school or any public places there?
My memory bank has none of that. No discrimination in my head at all. In fact, I want to come back because I think it links very well, because the question was previously about religious involvement in households. My brother and I, we had this young man, Joseph, attach himself to us, so we were all in the same household. Whenever my brother and I were picked somewhere, Joseph always cried and he got with us. It was just a great organizational structure on his part. But what was interesting, we had, when we left London to go to Devonshire, a Mr. Cohen was the teacher they sent along to us. And so he had Saturday mornings services in the school for us, through services. And when Passover came around, we were living in this charming Christian household with lovely, lovely women. And my brother, who's 3 years older, 3.5 years older than I, said, we celebrate Passover, and what do we do? She then wrote to London, and she got us boxes and other foods. As she said, no wine. But my brother ran a Seder for 5 kids who were part of the Kindertransport who were evacuated to Devonshire. So that was religion in action.
Daniel Weiser? Is Daniel here? Oh, that's you again? All right, you've already got. I'm going to skip this one. Cindy Fried or Freed? Okay, this is for Anita.
Hi. How do you think your life would be different with or without the Kindertransport?
How do you think your life would have been different without the Kindertransport?
Sometimes I wonder how my life would have been, but it's very, very hard to know. I'm glad that I had the life I had, that I survived, and I just felt, one day I realized that 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust, and I'm alive. There must be a reason. And I felt I had to give something back to society. And when my children went to school full time, I started to volunteer. I just felt I had to do something because life is precious. And speaking to students all the time, I feel that it's so important to keep our story alive, because if you don't, it can happen again. So that's really all I can tell you.
Yeah.
It is very hard to imagine how life would have been different.
So this is the last question we're going to ask, and it's for all the survivors. It's open. Reed, this is the second question for you. I'm just going to read it. Is that okay? Okay. It's a wonderful question. Looking at today's generation and government and the way we refuse refugees searching shelter, how does it make you feel, and what do you wish the new generation and generations to come will learn from your experiences?
I think the most important is to learn to respect each other and worry about other people and help people when they're in need. But the most important is not to hate, not to have prejudices. We're all different, but we're all alike at the same time. And I hope that the new generation will do the right thing.
I feel that I was a refugee and I found a wonderful home and I was supported, and I feel that I'm going to try and help, and I feel other people should support the refugee organizations and help people try and get out of their countries, or if they get here, to support them.
We are a global society. We're not an individual state. And in a global society, we have to consider that we are citizens of the world, and therefore we must treat our fellow citizens in a humane and privileged fashion. And so when we talk about taking kids away from borders, at the border, from in this day and age, I mean, that's similar to what we went through in terms of our parents having to send us away, except they knew they had to send us away. In this case, the parents didn't want them to be taken away, and they were taken away by a democratic government. That's not global. And we really have to look at the world from a global perspective. And I think your generation has learned that. And you're living in a very interesting time, especially in this country, that teaches you some interesting aspects of how society functions and perhaps shouldn't function.
America made a mistake in 1938. It could have saved 6 million people. I don't want history to repeat itself. What is going on right now? It is very important that all of you keep up with what is going on. And there's going to be an election in 2020. And you have to vote. I speak in colleges, I speak in schools, I speak in congregations and in posts. Wherever they ask me, I speak. And I speak especially to the young people who are now 16 years old or 18 years old. I said, it is your duty to vote. I was a refugee. I had to wait 5 years to become a citizen. I know how I felt the first time that I was able to vote. It is a big thing. It only comes once in your life. So please, if you know anybody, make sure that they're not citizen. Make sure to talk to them to become a citizen so they will be able to vote. As far as the wall is concerned, every time I see it on the news, it gives me a jab to my heart. We didn't have the wall. What we had was an affidavit. It was an invisible wall that kept us out. And I don't think too many came to America directly. I didn't come to America until 1962. So it's a long time, a difficult life. But now, be a good American and do what you have to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our survivors and to all the students. Those were outstanding questions. Unfortunately, we are already over time, but we don't have time to answer general questions from the public, but please feel free afterwards. I'm sure our survivors, if they can stay around a little bit, they will happily answer questions. And for the final component of our event, we're going to invite the Astoria Music Project back up. I will just say, I know some QCC students may have class. If you do need to leave, please just try to do so quietly and not disturb the rest of us, okay? Thank you so much. All right. Would you guys want to...
Thank you. And we're not offended if you get up and leave in the middle of this, so it's fine. Just as we get set up, I'll give you a little background on our next composer. We have Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, who was, he was from a family who came from a heritage of Sephardic Jews. They had actually fled they had fled Spain in 1492 and made their way to Italy. So he was born in Florence. Thank you. And he actually had to flee again in his lifetime during the rise of the fascist party in the 1930s. So his recognition as a composer began due to his association with something called the International Society of Contemporary Composers. It was a group formed after World War I to try to create a sense of unity after the divisiveness and belligerence of the war. His music has been described very interestingly, differently by multiple different people as avant-garde or progressive or neo-romantic or post-impressionist. But he said, quote, that he never believed in modernism or neoclassicism or any other ism. And so prior to the announcement of the official anti-Semitic laws in Italy, his music was banned from the Italian radio, and live performances were canceled of his music. In 1938, he left Italy and made his way to the U.S., where he and his violinist friend Joshua Heifetz helped organize a contract for him with MGM. In addition to a 15-year career in film scoring, he is known primarily for guitar works. Sadly, a lot of his work does not remain, it remains unpublished to this day, and so a lot of it is very difficult to find. But we found this piece, which we really thought would be a nice addition to this concert, because it is a lullaby. And that's one thing that I think a lot of children will remember when they're older. They might not remember everything, but something about a lullaby sticks with you. And we should have our translation ready. Okay, great. So this is Nina Nana by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco.
Oh, well. That's no problem. Are you going with Anita?
Thank you.
So if you look at our group, you'll notice that we're kind of a weird instrumentation here. We have French horn, Amanda Lee. I'm Stephanie Izzo, the soprano. We have Rachel Hauser on violin, and of course, David Taubman on piano. It's not a usual makeup for a lot of music, so there's not a ton actually written for this ensemble. We were really excited to find not only a piece written for voice, horn, violin, and piano, but written by a woman, and written by a woman who came to the U.S. as a refugee due to the Nazi occupation of her homeland in Vienna. So we found this piece by Vali Weigel, and she was born in Vienna. She and her sister, Kathy, were very interesting characters. They came from a Jewish family, but they didn't observe the traditions of the religion, so they didn't really consider themselves Jewish. And they both received advanced degrees and worked, which was kind of unusual at the time. And her sister became a political activist, a suffragette. She unfortunately was imprisoned and later died in a concentration camp. But Vali and her husband Carl, who was a composer and music professor, managed to make it out of Austria. They were designated Jewish, even though they weren't actually practicing. And so even though he didn't really want to leave, he was very reluctant to leave, they got out. And it was lucky that they did, because most of their families did not survive. They were able to get through Switzerland to the U.S. thanks to the help of the Quakers and a group called the New Friends of Music. So they came to New York. Her husband struggled a little bit with adjusting, but she kept composing, she kept studying, and she actually pursued another degree in music therapy. So she really believed in the power of music to heal. And she, after her husband's death, she devoted a lot of her time to publishing his music and his legacy. I'm going to read you this quote that I got from the foundation, the Carl and Vali Weigel Foundation, which I found very interesting. In exile, Vali always expressed that she had had to flee Austria for political reasons. She never acknowledged that her Jewish heritage had played a role. It is conceivable that she rejected all forms of segregation, whether on the basis of origin, age, or gender, and that she therefore refused on principle, even after the fact, to accept an identity imposed on her by her persecutors, particularly when it was an identity not of her own choice or lived experience. She believed in the power of music to bring people of all backgrounds together. This was also the foundation of her music making. Clearly, she thought works of art to have more lasting effects in this regard than political pamphlets. So while she might not have been as active as her sister, I think a lot of what she brings to her music you can argue that it has been very lasting. So she has this piece of 5 songs. We're going to do 2 of them for you from a piece called Echoes from Poems with poetry by Patricia Benton. The 4th movement and the 5th movement. I just want to give you something to listen for in the 5th one, because it's funky. She writes you'll notice that in a lot of the parts, the violin and the piano are written in 4/4 time, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but the horn and the voice are in 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, versus the 4. So it sounds like it's a little off, but we always end up meeting in certain places. And then at some points, my voice part meets with them and switches back and forth, and then the horn is left all by herself. Sorry. So she wrote really interesting compositionally, rhythmically there. So these are 2 of her poems by Vali Weigel. So we're really excited because I'll show you my score. It's literally just a scan of her handwritten score, because a lot of her stuff has not been published. So this is very exciting for us to be able to perform this for you today. Thank you.
Sleep in my father's house, where ancient
Now we've reached the sing-along portion of the program. We'll leave you with this piece by Irving Berlin, who you probably heard a billion times and not realize that it was written by a Russian Jewish immigrant. So Jerome Kern once said, quote, "Irving Berlin has no place in American music. He is American music." He was born Israel Belin in what is believed to be present-day Belarus. Berlin's family immigrated to the U.S. in 1893, settling in New York. And he, at age 13, was forced to earn money as a street busker and a singing waiter. Those existed even back then, with the death of his father at an early age. By age 19, he'd published his first song, and by 23, he had written his first international hit. It would not be his last. Living to be over 100 years old, his output is more than 1,000 songs. His music forms the fabric of what is known as the American Songbook. Some of his classics include Cheek to Cheek, There's No Business Like Show Business, White Christmas, and of course, this famous anthem to his beloved adopted country stands out in his impressive list of works, and feel free to sing along with us if you know the words. Or if you don't, it's fine. Thank you so much. We're so honored to be here today. Thank you to the survivors for sharing their stories. We're very moved. Thank you all. I know there's some refreshments in the back. We'll provide some refreshment music, a special treat for you as you eat your food. But thank you all so much for having us. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, everyone. Please do join us in the back for some refreshments.